This is FRM Part 1, Book 1, Foundations of Risk Management, and Chapter 3, which is Corporate Governance and Risk Management. In this chapter, we're going to build on some of the good topics that we discussed in the first two chapters, and then we're going to tie them into the umbrella of corporate governance. Now, in the second chapter, we talked a little bit about the board of directors, but we're going to get a little bit more specific about other groups and individuals that are going to be related to and responsible for risk management. So here are the learning objectives. What we're going to do is compare and contrast the best practices in corporate governance and those in risk management. There's the board of directors learning objective, risk appetite and business strategy, the relationship between those two. Distinguish the different mechanisms for transmitting risk governance throughout an organization. That's going to be an important one. Look at the functional units and then assess the role of the audit committee. So let's go ahead and start. Let's look at the link between corporate governance and risk management, that first learning objective. All right, corporate governance refers to a system of rules and practices and all sorts of stuff that are in place by the business's leaders to ensure things like accountability and transparency. And then, of course, the goal of any business is to maximize shareholder wealth, and maximize shareholder wealth means doing such things that will maximize shareholder wealth in the long term. That's why value there is in parentheses. Now, risk management, of course, is a critical part of corporate governance. So we've got to develop and define clear rules and regulations and procedures that govern all risk management activities. I mean, and let's face it, how many management activities are there that don't involve some risk? Now, failure of the risk management function can regularly and in extreme frequency be blamed on improper governance. All we have to do is look back to the 2008 financial crisis. Lack of transparency, breakdown, no accountability. Boy, have I said this before in the previous videos? Identify risk, quantify risk, and manage risk. And of course, there are a couple of individuals and groups of individuals that are really important to this link: board of directors, the chief executive officer, the chair of the board, and then the chief risk officer. Here's a good example. I'm guessing that lots of you guys have heard the story of the Barings Bank. This is, boy, what is that, 25 years ago by now. Lots and lots of stuff that was written at the time in the Wall Street Journal. There have been books written on this particular event. $7 billion in a matter of hours. And so the only way you can do this kind of a volume is if you have the backing of a financial institution. Of course, that's what this guy had, but he also had access to computers and algorithms so that he could execute these trades in the derivatives market in a very short time period. And then he lost all that money and the bank collapsed. And so, I mean, this really only could occur if there was a strange concurrence of events. But the leading events was that this guy was extremely successful early on after he started working. And so he was pretty much allowed to do whatever he wanted. Now remember, the goal of any business, the goal of any publicly held corporation is to maximize the wealth of the shareholders. And so we're going to look after the interests of shareholders. So we need to identify the risks. You've heard me say that many, many times. What that means then is that in the capital budgeting decision, that good corporate governance and good strategy developed by the board of directors is going to encourage the corporate leadership to develop product lines that have a risk-adjusted return that's going to satisfy the shareholders. It's easy. It's much easier to identify and predict cash flows from a new product line than it is to evaluate the risks associated with that product line. And so it has to be a risk-adjusted return. Now, the board is also has to look out for the interests of the bondholders and any other holders of debt. And in doing so, particular in the capital budgeting process, when looking at any individual capital project, the probability of insolvency has to be assessed. So this new concept, relatively new concept of risk governance, in which there is a link between the corporate governance world and the risk management world, those two groups, and remember, there's probably going to be some overlap between and among those groups, but there has to be a link so that the corporate governance structure is aware of the particular risks associated with not only the entire business, but with specific units. Now, one of the ways that corporations have done this, and this goes back to the mid-1990s with some suggestions from the New York Stock Exchange that the chief executive officer and the chairman of the board ought to be two separate individuals, and the chairman of the board ought to be independent of the firm. What that allows is a scenario under which the chairman of the board, who essentially sets the agenda for all the board meetings, can do so without any undue influence from the corporate leadership. All right, responsibilities of the board of directors, looking out for the interests of shareholders. We talked about that. Also looking out for other stakeholders, including things like employees and debt holders. And I always tell my students to think of the supply chain as a group of stakeholders, all the people from whom we get stuff, and then all the people to whom we sell stuff. Think about that as the entire supply chain. And what that means is that we're going to make these capital budgeting and capital structure and dividend policy and other decisions so that we can sustain profitability. So remember, the goal of the business is to maximize shareholder wealth over the long term. What that means is to be able to invest in projects that are going to generate cash flows today, and next month, and next year, and next decade. So the important word there is sustainability. And of course, the board is elected by the owners of the business, elected by the shareholders, to monitor the corporate leadership. Because after all, what could the corporate leadership do? The corporate executives, they could issue a bond, let's say $10 billion of a bond, and make a promise to the bondholders and the shareholders, and then they could take that money and invest it in themselves. And so the board is there to manage that agency conflict, that natural battle between the shareholders and the corporate leaders. Governance roles, of course, should be independent of executive roles. So the board and the CEO should act independently of each other. And then there's lots of a push to have chief risk officers who attend the board meetings and report directly to the board. Continuing on with this thought, board members must understand that the business strategies and the associated risks. So remember, the board establishes the strategic plan. And then, of course, the board has tremendous experience in their areas of expertise. And so they bring lots of experience, lots of skill, lots of intellect to board meetings, but they're not going to be experts across the entire spectrum of activities of the board. So each board member is responsible for bringing their own idea of risk assessment with their experience so that they can kind of form an umbrella of a risk management system. And of course, they've got to be transparent, and they will set an appropriate risk appetite. And I always like to use my hands to give examples. And the board could get together and say, okay, we can tolerate this much risk, or we can tolerate this much risk. What is that appetite? And what that means then, and so whether it's this much or this much, the board then conveys that to the corporate leadership, and then that becomes a part of business planning. Let me take just a quick example. Milton Hershey gets up every day, and what does this guy do? He makes chocolate, he makes chocolate, he makes chocolate. And about 20 years ago or so, he woke up one morning and said, I want to make breath mints. Boy, this was a complete deviation from the strategy that Milton Hershey had been using for lots and lots of years. Now, of course, Milton Hershey has not been with us for quite some time. And so it was the board that decided, hey, if we're going to make chocolate, we're taking this much risk. But if we're going to expand into icebreakers, we're going to have to expand our risk appetite. And so now, of course, Icebreakers is a brand name, just like a Hershey Kiss is a brand name. So here's a good illustration about the risk management compass. Okay, so they're really just 4 choices. And so let's start with the obvious one outside the box. If we reject the risk, then we don't want to take that risk, so that activity then is just discarded. But if we're going to accept the risk, then we can accept it within the firm, and then we can just pay for it if something goes wrong. What we can do is we can use derivative securities or insurance contracts to lessen or mitigate the risk. And notice that circle is kind of half in and half out. And so that thing could be way out. I mean, we can completely eliminate the risk, or it can be almost way in, and we can almost completely accept it. And so that's really an important part of the risk management process of determining what percent of that risk that is acceptable to hedge. You know, the great example is the airline companies, and some of the airline companies, they hedge lots and lots of their commodity price risk by using oil futures contracts, and others are just the opposite. And then, of course, we can just transfer it completely outside the firm, and this is usually done through, probably an insurance contract or some kind of an outsourcing arrangement. All right, key points here. Risk management strategies should be directed to impact economic performance. Of course, what are we trying to do? We're trying to maximize the value of the firm. We do that by making certain that those projects are going to generate lots and lots of cash flows, lots and lots of operating cash flows that are sustainable, which means they go on for quite some time period. What that's going to do is are you ready for this? It's going to swell the equity portion of the balance sheet to make the company more valuable. Now, while of course we respect what the accountants do, but we're not too terribly interested in accounting performance as measured by something like net income, because we know that net income figure is the result of lots and lots of decisions that are at the discretion of the accountants. And there's no doubt that human nature is going to result in accountants picking and choosing accounting procedures that might massage the data to make the profit look just a little bit better than maybe what it actually is. What we want to impact economic performance. We want cash. Cash is king. We learn that in almost every one of our finance textbooks. All right, so policies and directives and even infrastructure related to risk management should be properly placed in a firm. Of course, what we want to do is put this responsibility on individuals or groups of individuals who are highly skilled in this area. And then, of course, the executives and the managers and the staff ought to be paid according to their risk-adjusted performance. What this does is it imposes a layer of protection against financial manipulation and stock price boosting. And then what that also does is it increases the quality of the financial statements and the reliability of the information that's contained in those financial statements. Of course, the board has to be educated on risk management. Remember what I said earlier, that each board member is going to bring their own kind of a sense of risk management principles, and that might be contained in a silo from their particular risk management experience inside of their own firms. And so they're going to bring something, and then over here they're going to bring something. So you have all these individual silos, and then you open up the silo. I don't know, maybe you can pour them out into each other. And so this is an education of risk management. And then we need to decide about risk metrics. Are we going to use standard deviation? Are we going to use value at risk? Are we going to use something that our own economics people or our own stats people, our own operations people, or our own marketing research people have come up with that might be proprietary, that's more appropriate for what this particular firm is trying to do? So, of course, technical sophistication is required to build those strategies, and the risk committee should be qualified. Of course, that makes perfect sense. How about the role of the audit committee? Think of the audit committee. This is the way I always thought of it when I was an undergraduate majoring in accounting. I always thought of the auditors of a business as like the parents. So they come in and they say something like, all right, did you do your homework? Did you brush your teeth? Did you do all this stuff? And your parents try to keep track of all the stuff that you do. And so the accountants are kind of the same thing. And then the individuals on the audit committee, they're kind of like the ultimate parents. And so their responsibility is to make sure that the financial information is accurate, that the regulatory reporting is accurate, that the quality of the processes is high enough to be able to satisfy that goal of the risk-adjusted return for shareholders. All right, audit committee, of course, these should be independent, so I'm calling those non-executives in the slide. And they should have their cell phones open to anybody, especially the upper management who wants to communicate with them. So the audit committee verifies all the activities. Remember, we had a president of the United States who had one of these little mantras, trust but verify. And of course, we're going to comply with all the standards. All right, how about this risk advisory director? All right, this is going to be the presence of non-executives without any risk management expertise on the board may create an environment where decisions are made that are not so completely thought out. So the point is that we need a risk management specialist. Let's call this individual a risk advisory director on the board. All right, so there are a couple of things here that are crucial to the successful risk advisory director. Oversee development, oversee financial reporting, ensure compliance, participate in risk committee meetings. And essentially, what that risk advisory director is going to do is be the individual who is aware of all of the laws and rules and regulations and statistical metrics out there and be able to apply them to the agenda that comes across the board. And that includes this Basel III, which was developed years ago so that international financial institutions would have a set of rules that they could comply with. Value at risk is a relatively new statistical measure, not too terribly new, but relatively new statistical measure that asks the question something like, hey, if you have $100 and you lost $5 out of that $100, how sad would you be? And so value at risk gives you a probability of losing more than a certain amount. So that's really critical to be able to identify what that certain amount is. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 2%, or maybe it's 10%. But this swings back to the appetite that's crafted by the board. And then the International Financial Reporting Standards 9, that's the reporting standards for all the derivative securities and all the hedging instruments. And then SARBOX was passed in the United States. What is that? That's not quite 20 years ago. This was after we had the Enron and Global Crossing and all of those firms that, they kind of misled us about their financial statements. So that was passed to ensure more accuracy in financial statement and financial reporting. All right, how about the risk management committee of the board? So they're going to independently, this is really important, independently review the different forms of risk, like market risk, like liquidity risk, like interest rate risk. And then the policies of the firm, like the Milton Hershey example, moving into a brand new market, how do those risks relate to maximizing shareholder wealth? Of course, monitor portfolios, approve individual credits, and then report back to the board. How these risk governance mechanisms work. So a recommendation about the risk appetite of the firm is given to the risk committee of the board by the senior risk committee. And so that board is going to approve the risk appetite, and they're going to delegate authority to the senior risk committee. They're going to document and enforce policies pertaining to risk. And then the chief risk officer is going to frame the risk management strategy. Now, of course, this risk, let me go back here. This risk governance mechanism inside of the management strategy is going to have implications for the business risk committee. Remember, business risk is kind of like variability in profitability, somewhere in the middle of the income statement. And so just think revenues minus expenses, whatever that means in kind of the broad sense. And so the business risk have to be in line with the risk appetite of the firm. And that includes with the booking and the settling of all trades, whether or not they're marked to market or whether it's an insurance contract that you sign today and it might not be completed for 1 year or even 10 years. Now here's a good figure with kind of a loop. Let's go ahead and start in the middle on that left-hand side. So we start with risk management. This is kind of stuff that we've talked about during this particular slide deck. So we're going to develop risk policies. We're going to monitor. We're going to model and put together some spreadsheets, do some sensitivity and maybe scenario analysis, an independent view on risk, and then bring some support to other business needs. And so what that does is that those established procedures then go to the senior management who approves these business plans and targets, sets the risk tolerance, and then ensures the performance. And what that does, that then swings over to those 3 boxes on the right-hand side: trading room management, operations, and finance. And those 3 operations, of course, are their own kind of silos. So they're going to have their own unique sets of risk and risk management strategies. But then it's the responsibility of the risk management committee to break down those silos to form an overall business level of risk appetite. And then, of course, we swing back. There's a feedback loop. And so we learn from our mistakes and we learn from our successes. And then we go back and reestablish those risk management principles. So this is a good loop to understand interdependence for managing risk. How about market risk authorities? All right, we have a couple of steps here. So we got the risk committee, senior risk committee, the chief risk officer, the heads of every business, and then the business unit managers. And so what does this risk committee do? Approves the market risk tolerance pretty regularly. I mean, let's go ahead and say each year. And then there are some steps that the senior risk committee must complete. And these sound like things like approving market risk tolerance, stress importance, and performance limits for each year, and then does some review, delegates authority, and then approves all of these policies by the risk committee. The chief risk officer then is responsible for the independent monitoring of all of the things above it. And then in addition to some other stuff, heads of the business are going to share responsibilities, and then each business unit manager does something similar. But what that business unit manager is going to do is be responsible for the performance and the risk levels for each business unit. And then the audit function, getting back to my example of the parent. So this is an independent assessment, reports back to the board, monitors the adequacy and the reliability of the documentation, integrity. There's a value at risk model I put in there. And then stress testing methodologies. Stress testing means that what we're going to do is say, all right, if we do this stuff and things go really, really well for us, how is it going to push out on that side of the model? That's probably all good stuff. And then on this end, if things go against us, it's the worst case scenario, and it pushes out on this end of the model, how's that going to work out for us? So stress testing and those sound risk metrics and measures, evaluating and designing. All right, let's go ahead and work through some concluding remarks here. So it's not possible to control the financial health without excellent risk management function and an appropriate risk metric. All right, so let's go back to identify the risk, quantify the risk, and manage the risk. I've said that in every one of these chapters, and it's really the theme that applies to many of these learning objectives. Clear risk management policies, a risk committee, and a framing risk management methodology that sounds reasonable. It meets the smell test. What it's going to do is identify areas of concern and identify areas of success so that we can repeat the successful areas and that we can avoid the failures. And then economic capital can set risk limits. If we have this much capital, then maybe we should just take this much risk. And then finally, of course, compensation schemes should be aligned with risk management. Let's see how we did. Learning objectives recap. We did the best practices. We talked about the board. We talked about risk appetite and the strategy, risk governance and the functional units, and the firm's audit committee. So thanks for watching. Next up, ERM.